Hi, everyone. Welcome to the newest episode of Closing Strong. I am Tara McGowan, founder and publisher of Courier, joined by my good friend and Hopium Chronicles Substack writer and evangelist, Simon Rosenberg. We have an amazing program for you all. We are just 2 weeks and change away from Election Day, but millions and millions of Americans are already voting across the country. I feel the energy in my veins. I can't wait to talk about it with you, Simon. But we have with us this week my friend and Courier national correspondent and former Trump administration official and senior advisor, Olivia Troye, to talk to us about the Harris Walls Republicans for Harris efforts and coalition building on the ground across the battleground states, as well as our friend Tom Bonier to talk to us about all of the record breaking voter registration and early votes. Simon, how are you?
I'm good. I feel good. I mean, this has been I think that one thing I think about a lot is that Kamala Harris has had a good week every week that she's been in this race and that she got in this thing down 3, we're now up 3. The polling has been very steady and very consistent. We actually had some very good polls for her this week. I know there's this kind of meme that the election is because of a single poll, the election is kind of getting worse for us. That's not true in the national polling. The 538 average is actually we actually are a little bit higher this week than we were a week ago in the 538 national polling average. We had a very good poll from the Economist YouGov yesterday showing her up 4, and the New York Times is up 4. And, we had the Marist poll, very high quality poll, up 4, up 5, actually. Tip was up 4, gaining, right? She gained in a couple of these polls. So, where I think the election is that we're at the point now where polling is not going to be able to tell us very much other than it's a really close election.
I was going to
And
say, all
yeah,
those polls don't matter. We know they
yeah,
all say the
right,
same thing.
right. They
It's
all
going to
say
be
that, and
really
it's
close.
important for people to realize this that polls are going to jump around. Just in the last few weeks, this election's close today. It's going to be close on election day, and but I think that what makes me optimistic is two things. One is that something that we will be talking about a little bit later is that we have been overperforming public polls and expectations in election after election since Dobbs. I think they've been underperforming and struggling. I think this is far more likely to be what happens in the next few weeks than Trump overperforming. There just hasn't been an election in the United States since Dobbs where the Republicans have done better than everybody thought they were going to. And it's very similar to what happened in Europe with in the European elections and the French elections, where people on the center right, when it became time to go vote, they just couldn't pull the lever for the fascists, and they dramatically underperformed public polling. And that's what's also been happening here. I still think that's far more likely to be the case. And then the second thing is the whole reason we're doing this show is our capacity to close strong and end the election, moving the election towards us is just much greater than theirs. We're putting more ads on the air. We have a far superior ground operation. We have this voter reg surge that Tom Bonier is going to be talking about in a little bit. And I think it just means that in these final few weeks, if we all go do the work, if we all take responsibility to that we can move this election collectively through our work together and this unprecedented grassroots army that we have to make the election we all want to have. But it only will happen if we do the work and we continue to donate and postcard and canvas and text and phone call and be information warriors, all these things that we do, because it's the way I view this is our lead is an opportunity that we have to seize. We are winning the election, but we haven't won it yet. And now we have to go win it together. And so I remain, in a place that's potentially guided by hopium but also based on data that I would much rather be us than them with 3 weeks to go, but we got to go do the work, everybody, to make it the election we all want it to be.
Yeah, every single thing anyone and everyone can do matters. I have been so inspired by so much of the content I've been consuming on the socials
Yeah.
lately, including from people just showing up and talking into their camera about how they asked a person, a friend, or someone they ran into at the grocery store if they had a plan to vote, and that person was still on the fence or didn't know how to vote. Like that is actually the work that anyone and everyone can do wherever they are, is just truly ask the people in their life or in their surroundings if they voted or if they have a plan to vote, because you just don't know when that makes a difference. And as somebody who absolutely loves talking to voters at the doors and canvassing, it's one of the most meaningful and gratifying experiences I've ever had in the work I've done in politics, is just being able to help somebody get the information they might not have otherwise. And now is the time to do that, especially because so many states have early votes going. So it is exciting. It's nerve wracking. It is close, but it's the margin of effort, as we like to say.
Well,
So it really is
yeah.
a lot of work.
So Tara, I what I want to know. I mean, I went through my wrap, but the last few weeks feels like we are seeing the emergence of a completely different kind of presidential campaign than we've ever seen before. And I wonder if you could reflect on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, this campaign's unprecedented in a lot of ways. I think I have an interesting take on this. I think you're probably referring to the Harris campaign's media strategy as of late,
Yeah.
which is very reminiscent of Pete Buttigieg's media strategy when he was running for president in the Democratic primaries in 2020, which is a go everywhere strategy. Go actually where audiences that are not the most politically engaged, that are not the news junkies like us, where they spend their time, what content they consume, what podcasters or substackers or bloggers or what have you they read, because these are folks that, at Courier, we focus entirely on what we call passive news consumers, people who don't read traditional news, they don't pay paywalls. That is the majority of Americans, and it is absolutely the majority of low turnout, non and new voting Americans. So we have seen a really incredible multifaceted communications and media strategy by the Harris Walz campaign as of late. And I am also tickled by how their non traditional media strategy for the vice president and Tim Walz has been berated and whined about by traditional,
Yeah.
we've talked about this before, but by traditional political reporters and news outlets and things of that nature, because they feel neglected. It's really, their whining is really about them. But they are not as relevant. And I do believe that this election, we are already seeing this in real time, but that traditional media is not really relevant. And it's really not useful when it comes to actually getting your message out to the millions of Americans, and in some states, thousands of Americans that actually will determine the outcome of this race and many, many, many other races down the ballot, because they are not the ones that are watching cable news. They are not the ones that are reading the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post. And so I think it has been incredible to see the Harris campaign put her everywhere, from, yes, traditional outlets like 60 Minutes, where Trump would not go, but also call her daddy. And she was just on with Charlemagne the God this week, and many, many, many of the late night shows. And I think that we are going to potentially see her on Joe Rogan, which would be enormously impactful to
Yeah.
reach so many men, and especially young men. I know many of them who love that guy for reasons I don't always understand, but really they respect him. So I think that would be really meaningful. She was on Howard Stern. It's been really incredible. But the other thing that I have really, really, really admired and been excited about out of the campaign is how they're sort of sticking it to traditional media in their approach as well. In one of Harris's rallies this week, she played clips of Trump at his rallies to show just how unhinged he is right now, which I know we have a ton that we can dig into there, because there's been so much this past week. But it wasn't just her showing right at her rally these moments to make the point that he is unhinged and unfit to be president of this country, but also to get the media to cover it more. Because there has been an asymmetry, including when Biden was at the top of the ticket, where the media was just not covering. They have normalized Trump in a way that they don't cover some of his more unstable and unfit moments. And I thought that was really brilliant for the campaign to do. And I think that they are being really creative in ways that we have not seen campaigns do, and taking more risks that we've not seen presidential campaigns do historically, to really get the message out that the traditional media frankly won't. And I think that that is necessary and also just really, really commendable.
Yeah, I agree with you. We talked about this a few weeks ago, and it's something that I literally think about almost every day, which was the first interview she did with Dana Bash with Governor Walz. That was so confrontational, right? It was so adversarial, And what has been just something that's been sticking with me as somebody who grew up at ABC News. You grew up at CBS News, right? We grew up in the old media. Is that how much more interesting and compelling the interviews are in the non-traditional media, how much more we learn, how frankly how more interesting they are, right? Like it's also just from a audience standpoint. The Call Her Daddy interview was really interesting, right? Like really good questions, and it was done in a non-adversarial way. And I think this part of what is going on with the legacy media, and you even saw with Brett Baer in the Fox interview, was just how unbelievably adversarial it was. And I think it's bad television. I think it's bad media. I think it's not enjoyable to watch. It repels you as opposed to bring you in. And I think it's why also she's prospered so much in these alternative environments because she is a nice person. She is a warm person. She is an interesting person. She's got an interesting story. She's got a lot to say that isn't able to be said when you've got the six Republican talking points you're being asked sequentially in an interview or in a debate, and so I think this has also just been really good for our democracy. Like I feel like we're having more honest conversations about things that really matter to people that are far more compelling and interesting than the kind of overthought and the overthinking that goes on in some ways, and this need to look like you can push people around as opposed to inform them. And that's we so it's been I think this has been a really interesting. One of the reasons I really wanted to do this show with you was that I wanted to learn about this new world we were heading into. Somebody who's a little bit older and grew up in the old media space, and is that I think we've seen a dramatic acceleration of the movement towards a far better media, right, in the last few weeks than we all really understand because it's happened so quickly. And yes, hats off to the Harris campaign for diving in, taking risks, right? Just doing what they felt needed to get done, not letting any kind of old school way of thinking get in the way of what they needed to do. Because remember, we're not going back, right? We're going forward. We're turning the page, right? And all that stuff. And they've been turning the page on a legacy media that I think has let the country down. And I think they've shown courage in doing this. She's shown courage. I was a regular guest on Fox News for 17 years. I did thousands of appearances. I've done as much Fox News probably in the last 20 years as virtually any Democrat. I don't do it anymore. And she showed enormous courage going into an environment where that it wasn't going to just be hostile. It was going to be some at a place above hostile. And she did a phenomenal job. And I just think the other thing I'll just say is that I think all of this media has grounded her as a candidate. I think that she has found her closing voice and she feels strong now. She feels authentic. She feels powerful. These rallies are incredible. And so she's closing strong at the time we needed her to do it. And I do think that in some ways, her journey through this media in the last few weeks regrounded her in the reasons why she was running and has given her the fuel to be able to close this thing the way that we need her to close it.
Yeah, and that clear distinction, right? Of, having worked, this is my fourth presidential cycle. I've been involved at the intersection of politics and media. Never before right now, I feel like, did a Democratic presidential campaign really embrace the understanding and adapt to the understanding that they could not rely on the traditional media, not to fact check the liars and the lies, not to deplatform the liars and the lies, not to get their message across. Like, really, I think in some ways, the Harris campaign has taken a page out of the early Trump campaigns, not this one, but the early Trump campaigns playbook to sort of ignore the traditional media outlets despite their sort of, holier than thou kind of navel gazing approach to this work and say, no, 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 we are in control. We need to get our message out to the right people. We're going to do this in a diversified way. And we're going to actually reflect where media is today, which is decentralized and diversified and in many ways more democratic. And I think the sort of defensive posture of traditional media outlets, and I'll call them like, old media dinosaurs, frankly, is that there is an accountability then. And that's not true. And we have made this point a bunch. You don't have to be aggressive to hold people accountable. Your job as a journalist, whether you work for a left leaning outlet like I run, or you work for one that claims objectivity or non bias like the New York Times, your job is to inform. Your job is to inform the public, not antagonize, not parrot the talking points of another side to try to get a reaction out of a candidate or elected official. And I think that that distinction has really been lost in traditional media today. And I think that's why they are failing in a lot of ways as an industry. And I think it's going to be really interesting and really exciting, channeling some hopium, if and when Harris is Madam President, to see how this administration actually embraces a communication strategy that is actually much more relevant and accessible to all of the American people, not just the elites who are watching and consuming that kind of old media.
I'm with you on that. And listen, I want to say, Tara, that we have a great show today. We have my good buddy Tom Bonier is going to come share some data with us. That's encouraging. And we're 3 weeks out. I won't say it's encouraging and we should feel better about where we are. But why don't you talk a little bit about Olivia? Because I know that you're very close to her and what we're going to hear from Olivia.
Sure. Yeah, Olivia Troye is a surprising friend, but her and I met a few years ago, and she was a senior advisor to Vice President Pence in the Trump administration. She left the administration. She was senior advisor as part of Homeland Security, but she was absolutely appalled by what she saw up close in that role and in that administration. And as a lifelong Republican who's also a Latina from El Paso, Texas, from a border town in this country, she is an incredibly, incredibly strong and committed patriot who could not live with herself to stay inside that party or that administration with Trump at the helm of it. And so she left and she did the bravest thing that I think that anybody can do in this line of work. And that is to really make herself a very, very, very strong and outspoken surrogate for the Harris Walz campaign and before that, the Biden campaign, and to be outspoken about what she saw and experienced in the Trump administration and how much she understands how much worse a second Trump administration would be, and how that first administration that he had did lay the groundwork for Project 2025. We're not going to get into all of that today, but she has a really unique perspective, but she's also one of the bravest people that I've ever met. And she is truly hitting the trail every single day across the battleground states, bringing Republicans together in support of the Harris Walz ticket. It's really, truly inspiring. And I'm very excited to hear what she is seeing and feeling on the ground with the work that she's doing.
Well, let's get to it. We got a great show.
Now, we're so pleased to be joined by my friend and a Courier National correspondent, and most importantly, a former Trump administration official and senior advisor, Olivia Troye. Olivia, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me. Woohoo, go Courier.
I'm always very excited to talk to you and vent with you and all of the things, but very excited and delighted to do it here with Simon as well. And want to kind of talk first with our audience, just for you to share. You're really heavily involved with the Harris Walz campaign as a surrogate for the campaign. And the campaign has been investing pretty heavily, from what we can see on the outside, in really, really, really building a very, very strong and diverse coalition of supporters across this country for their ticket, but also, of course, to oppose Trump at the polls and his party ticket. And so would love to just have you kind of go big and broad and talk about what that sort of looks like, being part of the campaign in that effort and the specific role you're playing. And then we can kind of go from there, because I'm really eager to hear what you're hearing on the ground from voters.
Yeah, sure. I have been very impressed with Kamala Harris's team and the way they're approaching this campaign. They have definitely done the work to build out an on the ground infrastructure across the battleground states. And they've specifically invested in reaching sort of the reachable middle, is what we call it, like the center right, center left voters. And more especially, they're really looking at trying to impact disaffected Republicans. And they're also doing a lot of outreach to the Haley voters that we saw come out in the primary against Trump. There's a significant size of them. I know, the word on the street, as my best friend from kindergarten always says, was that these were all Democrats that had signed up in the primary. The reality is that that's actually not true. There are a lot of Republicans that were really just fed up with Trump and were trying to push him off the ticket. Obviously, it didn't happen. So here we are. But I think it has been interesting. I've been part of this from really day one. And I think it's been inspiring in many ways to see sort of the development at the national level. But honestly, it's been so hopeful to me to see what's happening at the ground level, because I've been going to the events, I've been going to House events, And we're getting like a good, 100, people sometimes at people's homes gathering. And these are local residents to the areas that are Republicans or independents that are saying that they're fed up with what they're seeing and they're starting to kind of stand together. And I think for a while it felt very isolated being a Republican standing against Trump, kind of in my own little island here at times. But I do think that there's something that the tide is changing. And yeah. And so I guess I'll tell you a little bit. We did a major event yesterday, which was awesome.
Yeah, I saw some
And
of the
it was,
clips
yeah.
on social where I watch anything that has to do with this election, as you know, but it looked massive. So yeah, set the scene for us. What was the event? Who was hosting it and speaking at it?
So it was the VP herself. So Kamala Harris did speak at the event, and it was a Republicans for Harris rally. And it basically brought together hundreds of Republicans. A few of us were on stage with her, and it was former Republican members of Congress that were there, and just Republican state leaders, and then just part of this broader coalition. And a lot of Republicans in the audience, obviously. And I think it was inspiring. Jeff Duncan was there. He's a former lieutenant governor of Georgia. Adam Kinzinger spoke. He's former congressman for Illinois. We had Jim Greenwood, who's also a former congressman, who's actually a former congressman from Pennsylvania. And then I spoke as well. And then the VP was obviously the headliner, and she delivered what I would say was such an amazing and powerful speech that I would say is unprecedented for these times. She really just talked about what building these bridges across party lines and how she's very committed to it. I think it really resonated with the audience. She was very powerful about pushing back on Donald Trump and some of the things that he's been saying lately. And sort of, I think one of the lines that I think landed the best with the audience, and this was mentioned to me from a couple of the attendees, because I stayed afterwards to meet people at the event and really check on them and see how it's going out in Pennsylvania. And she said to them,
anyone who tramples on our democratic values, as Donald Trump has, anyone who has called for the, quote, termination of the Constitution of the United States, as Donald Trump has, must never again stand behind the seal of the President of the United States. Never again. Never again.
She nailed that line. And the response from the crowd, I mean, they went wild. It was nuts. And it was just truly inspiring to see just Republicans and Democrats coming together for the greater the good of the country, which is, traditionally we're very divided. We're very much in our party lines. Simon's laughing like, who are you telling, right? But it was just different. There was definitely a spirit of unity at this event, and it was camaraderie and just leaning on each other. And, she shook everyone's hand on stage. We went with her backstage, had conversations with her, and she's just seems very invested in being a president for all. And I think that was the overall tone of it. And, and then it was a good warm up for her to be around us, Republicans, because then she went into the Lion's Den and went to Fox News and did that amazing interview. So, we hope that we were like, we know we have your backs, is what we said to her. And we were cheering her on as she went in because we knew it would be combative. Let's be honest. This was going to be an interesting situation with Fox News, no matter what.
Well, and Olivia, you touched on something I would like you to dive into a little bit more, which is this idea of feeling alone, but not feeling alone anymore. It seems like this is so critical. We call it permission structure, that you and Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney are creating a permission structure for other people who feel that the way that you do to join you in abandoning Trump. And Adam Kinzinger, I thought at the convention also had one of you had a great line about how, not voting for the Republicans is not a betrayal, but it's a sign of patriotism, right? That you're doing the right thing for the country. But talk a little bit about that sense of community, and that if you felt alone and now you're not feeling alone, what does it mean when you go into somebody's house and there are 100, 150 people there who didn't know, and they see other people like them, right? Talk about that dynamic and how far along you think we really are in that, because this was always, to me, one of the great opportunities of this campaign, was that this was there for us. We could see it in the Haley vote. We could see it what happened in 2022. We know that in France and in Europe just recently, that center-right voters, when it came down to it, they abandoned the fascists and chose other options because they understood the gravity of the threat. We just saw this happen, right, in major elections in Europe, a very similar dynamic that we want to have happen here, right, where Republicans, I mean, the far-right fascists in Europe underperformed their polling because when people actually had to go vote, they just couldn't vote for the fascists, right? Just give us your assessment from inside about the sense of community that's being built and what you think it means for this election and even beyond.
I think it's hard to be I guess what I would say a old school Republican these days, because there is a lot of bullying that goes on. And you really end up feeling like the extreme arm of the party has taken over, which it really has. But it just feels lonely because they want, and I think, they're doing it on purpose, right? That's how authoritarian and fascism kind of works. They want you to feel isolated, and they want you to feel like they have control and that you're on the outskirts of it. And if you stick your neck out, you're crossing the line, and they want you to feel scared. And I think, quite honestly, I think that's a lot of what we're seeing on the ground, is that there's been a lot of Republicans. And look, I'm just going to be very honest with you. There's Republicans that have said to me, like, I'm going to vote for her. I'm just not putting a sign in my yard because I don't want to be targeted by the rest of my community here. And that's sad, right? Because to me, that speaks of where we are as a country. And I feel like one of the most important things for us is democracy and the right to vote and our liberty and our freedom to do that. And it used to be that we would be celebrating elections, right? And the right to vote, regardless of who we were voting for. And for me as a national security person, it makes me very sad, having deployed to countries where I've seen people or women have the right to vote for the first time, and how proud they are and how much they share in that pride, regardless of who you're voting for as a candidate. And we have really, I would say, gone backwards in this in terms of our country. And so I lay that as a groundwork because that's why I think, to me, it's inspiring to see these communities coming together and saying, hey, like, I'm actually not alone in this town. I'm not actually I felt like I was the only one, and I didn't want to, talk about it. I don't want to talk about it out loud. I'm not going to acknowledge it. But the whole hope is that by setting the permission structure, like you put it, Simon, that hopefully it's an example for others that we can do this, and we can do this together. And, do I think it's enough to make a difference this election? I actually do, because it feels just very different than it did for someone like me in 2020 when I first went public against Trump. And in 2022, it just feels like there are more voices that are willing to talk about this and be more open, and actually there's a lot more, like, more people that I would say are fed up with what has happened here under Donald Trump. Now, I say that because I think, I always say, like, we have to welcome these people into the fold. There's been conversations. I've gotten messages from people that are like, I'm not going to lie to you, I've voted for Donald Trump like the last 2 times, and I was really actually considering it. Like, I've been voting for the MAGA candidates. I voted for the MAGA candidates in 2022. I'm now kind of looking back on that and really, starting to assess, like, was I part of the damage? That was one conversation I had with someone yesterday in Pennsylvania. And my advice to them, my counsel, I guess, was, I think, we can all reflect on what we're seeing here as being part of the GOP and what's happened in the past. But the important thing is right now that we're actually making a difference to bring others into the fold in that way, in that spirit, to make a difference together. And I know everyone, knows that this election, it's been said that it's going to be close. We're just hoping that enough of those quiet voices will be the ones voting. And I just, I have faith that there will be that voting block that's there. They just may not be the loudest. But I think events like yesterday, where you have the show of numbers, you have these, the 2 farmers. There were actually, I should talk about this because this is amazing. There's 2 lifelong farmers in Pennsylvania that have been lifelong Republicans. And the husband got up there and he was like, look, I voted for him twice. It was actually kind of cute. He looked at his wife. He's like, my wife wisened up. She only voted for him once.
We have been Republicans all our lives. We both voted for Donald Trump. I voted for him twice. It made sense. We are Republicans. You vote for the Republican candidate. I should make a note, Christina was ahead of the learning curve. She only voted for him once.
Which also I was like, of course it's the women. But anyways, I'm not going to say anything. Women knew. course it's the women. But I thought that that was very impactful because these are not people that, are sitting there saying, like, I've become a full Democrat. I believe in everything. Like, no, they're telling you, like, no, I've been a very true Trump Republican, but I've reached the limit and I just want something better for our country. And just someone who's owned a farm. It's just been in his family for 3 generations, and he owns a farm in Pennsylvania. Now, the counter to that, I will say, is they have gotten the threats, they've gotten the bullying, they've gotten the intimidation, and has it kind of given them like pause? I mean, has it scared them? Probably a little bit. I talked to them, and they were like, I was like, would you change your mind? And they've said, no, absolutely not. We know that this is the right thing for the country. And I think it's important for people to see just everyday Americans like that are standing together. And I saw the vice president, the way she interacted with them, and I have to say, like, it's just, I've been around a lot of politicians, I'll say that, and a lot of cabinet level people, and I have, I think you can tell when something is genuine or an act, and I really, truly, honestly believe that she is genuine interactions with people.
And Olivia, I just want to underscore the bravery it takes, because I know I've known you a while, and it was a lot lonelier, and it is incredible. I got goosebumps when I watched clips of that event that you spoke at this week, and just all of the people in the crowd. And it is a testament to what you and Simon were talking about a permission structure, is that there is power in numbers. Seeing people gather and all be comfortable and feel safe and excited even to come out and show their support for this ticket together is incredible. And on the other side of it, to your point, the vice president in embracing this community and embracing this. And I do want to touch on the Fox News interview this week, because I thought it was incredible. I thought it was an incredible interview by the vice president. I think that she was strong and assertive, and also just the fact that she went on Fox, I think, is incredibly noteworthy about reaching out and going directly to these audiences and to Republicans, and to be able to say, look, you hear all this stuff about me, but here is actually where I stand. Here is, who I am on it. And so would love to have you sort of reflect on that. I know one of the most viral moments, of course, about it was when she really took Brett Baier to task on the Trump
Yes.
repetitive enemy within comments, and would love to hear how that sort of sits with you and the community of Republicans supporting Harris on the ticket.
I thought it was great that she called him out on it in real time. I mean, that was incredible. The fact that she just immediately was like, no, actually, what you're showing, that clip is incorrect.
Brett, I'm sorry, and with all due respect, that clip was not what he has been saying about the enemy within that he has repeated when he's speaking about the American people. That's not what you just showed.
Well, he was asked about that
No,
specific...
that's not what you just showed. In all fairness and respect to you,
that was the question that we asked him.
You didn't show that, and here's the bottom line. He has repeated it many times, and you and I both know that. And you and I both know that he has talked about turning the American military on the American people. He has talked about going after people who are engaged in peaceful protest. He has talked about locking people up because they disagree with him. This is a democracy.
I mean, it was kind of like disinfo in real time, right? What they were trying to do. And they were obviously playing a game of like got you and covering for Trump in some way. I mean, that's what they do. But I think it was commendable that she was like, no, and she did it, I thought, by the way, in a very diplomatic way, right? I like the fact that she said, with all due respect, that's not what he said. Let me clarify for you. And then, of course, it doesn't take long, because the good thing about Donald Trump is like he repeats himself over and over as ridiculous, whatever it is that he said it. He's not just going to say it once. He can't help himself. So he then goes out and confirms it again, right? And all these other things. So it's not like we can say, oh, well, he only said it once. No, he's actually reminding us that he did say the enemy within are other Americans, which is quite appalling for someone that wants to be in the Oval Office again. The fact that he would say that. But, I think she was powerful in the interview. I think it was clear that she was very prepared for the type of environment that she would be walking into. Did I think that he came in aggressive and combative, and even his demeanor towards her was, in keeping what I figured would likely happen? I will say that, I mean, I had a hard time, I was listening to it actually when we were driving back from the event in Pennsylvania, and it was hard to not get annoyed and angry at his demeanor towards her, the way he kind of behaved. Especially, I just felt, I try to I rarely go here, but I'm going to go here right now. I really just felt that it was obvious the double standard against a woman, and the way he was behaving in his body language was really, I like rubbing me the wrong way. Like, and I went back and looked at the clips after listening in the car, and I was like, yeah, that's exactly what I thought it was going to be. But she had solid policy answers too, right? I mean, that was great. She was pushing back with substantive things that would never happen in a Donald Trump interview. She was in a very hard environment, and she held her own, I thought, and she held her own in a very substantive way.
Well, and can I just comment on that? I did thousands of appearances on Fox over 17 years. I was on 2 to 3 days a week during the entire Obama administration. And, I was never paid. And I did it in part, and I think this is what's so important about what happened yesterday. I did it in part because I wanted to show Republicans that there were Democrats who were willing to engage in civil dialogue.
Yes.
And it was a sign of respect. I was showing up in their place, and I never got angry. The key was you can't ever get rattled. You can't ever get, frustrated. But I felt this was an important thing for our democracy, that I was going into Fox News and demonstrating respect for the people there and speaking truth, and staying in my place and telling my story. And I think as part of the cultivation of the world that you're part of, the idea that she went into the media of the right, it was a sign of respect, right, to this community. And I think however the combative nature of it was,
Mm-hmm.
the sort of the big message was, I'm going to talk to you guys. You're part of my world, right? I'm not going to go into my silo over here. I mean, we're going to engage. So I applaud the courage that she showed. It was, as somebody, again, who has gone on with Hannity and with everybody, and I didn't go on with Brett that much. I was a little surprised with how aggressive he was in the beginning, right? In
Yes.
particular,
He wouldn't let her talk.
no, he wouldn't let her talk, and he was trying to rattle her. I mean, this is a tactic, right? But I know we have to go, Olivia, and maybe we can have you back on before we go. But I also want to echo something that Tara said, is that I just want to say, as a fellow patriot, I'm so grateful for what you're doing. I'm so proud of you. The courage that you've demonstrated throughout all of this, the courage that all of you are demonstrating in taking on your party and taking on Donald Trump and building this permission structure and community. It is the highest form of patriotism, in my view. And I just want to go on record, as Tara did, as saying, thank you for what you've been doing and what you're going to do, because we're going to win this fucking thing. And, and we're going to make Kamala Harris the president. And she is going to be the president of all Americans and not just Democrats.
And I can't wait to debate and
I agree
argue
with that.
issues with you at some point, for us to have the
What's that
privilege
like?
to do that,
I don't
Olivia.
know.
We haven't disagreed on anything since we met.
I know. That is true. Which says a lot. Where are we as a country, right?
The best of
More
it.
the greater common good. Exactly.
Best of it.
I will, I so much appreciate both of your sentiments. And I'll say this. I think what is important, to remember is that, those of us can take a stand, and it is hard. It is very hard to be in this space, and it can be ugly, and the threats and the harassment are ongoing. But you're playing a critical role as well by accepting us, right? It's about accepting us and just having our backs and saying, like, here we are, we're in this together. And I think that's a piece of it that's important to remember, right? Is that we're also leaning on you all, because we're kind of walking in no man's land here, and you guys and Kamala Harris, the Harris team, could have just been like, yeah, we're going to do this on our own, and you guys do your own thing. But I think it is very true that we're stronger together, I think. But it's been in great part because you've welcomed us in the vote, right? We didn't have to speak at the DNC, but we were invited to, and we were welcomed to speak at the DNC. And I think that's, speaks volumes about you all. And I'm grateful. Can't believe I'm about to say this. I'm grateful to the Democrats that are doing this right now, because I think that we are at a moment where it really is country over party, and we're seeing it from both sides. And I think that we should talk about that, because it is both sides bridging this, because we wouldn't be able to do it if both sides were kind of sitting in silo and not
Right.
extending that hand.
And if we can expand on that to actually govern that way, imagine that.
Yes.
Disagree on ideas and solutions, but not actually the common threads between us. That's the goal.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Olivia, for everything and for joining us. And I hope we get to talk soon.
Yes. Thank you all.
Thank you. Good luck on the trail.
Thanks, Olivia.
Thank you.
Welcome to what's going to be a fun discussion with my dear friend, Tom Bonier. data guru, head of TargetSmart and the Terra Group. Tom has been a very influential voice in recent years in helping us understand the data that's available to us about our election system. Tom, welcome today.
Yeah, it's great to be here with y'all.
So you have been talking over the last couple of days about this new research you've done on voter registration since Kamala Harris became the VP. Your site, Target Early, gives us unparalleled looks into the early vote. Talk a little bit about two things, right? One is why this kind of data matters in our understanding of the election, and then also what you're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, why it matters is pretty simple. It's like we have this sort of asymmetrical approach to understanding the electorate, which is about 95% of our understanding of the electorate. And I'm talking about like the public domain, not sort of behind the scenes, but it comes from polling. And that's generally just because that's what people have access to and that's what people are used to. And as we all know, as y'all have talked about, quite effectively, what polling sort of misses out on is the most important question of all, which is who's going to vote, where the intensity lies, which groups are peaking and surging in terms of interest and which groups just aren't that excited about how things are going. And so polling it generally lags a cycle behind, right? Like you look at the likely voter models in these polls now that we're all consuming, and they're generally based on some sense of let's take what happened in 2020 in terms of turnout for each group and let's adjust for some population changes and throw it out there. And that's fine as a relatively transparent metric, but what we know is that it's very rare when you have two consecutive presidential elections or midterm elections where that actually happens. And so what we're trying to do with the registration data, or what we're actually doing, is we're looking into who, in terms of these different groups, looking at age, race, gender, ethnicity, education, all these important elements of political decision making, who are actually standing up and taking the actions that are actually indicative of being engaged in this election. And so new voter registration has historically been the best indicator of that. And there's still noise you have to sort through there, right? Like a lot of states have automatic voter registration. And so we're not even so much looking at the raw overall numbers. We're looking at peaks and valleys in those numbers. So automatic voter registration wouldn't explain why 70% of new registered voters in the lead up to the Kansas post-Dobbs election were women, right? That wasn't automatic voter registration. That was overwhelmingly young women coming out and saying, no, I have to vote in this election. And then they actually participate and they turn out at a higher rate than all men. It's that sort of thing.
The Taylor Swift bump.
Exactly. Well, so that's the cool thing to me about this analysis is like what we've been looking at. There's really like a few periods in time. And like, even if you were in like some sort of deep sleep during the last few months and you went back and looked at the data, what you would say is, okay, something really big happened after July 21st because huge spike. Something big happened in late August. Something big happened in early September. And those something big were, as we know, the President Biden withdrawing from the race and endorsing the vice president, the Democratic convention, the presidential debate, followed by the Taylor Swift, Instagram post, endorsement, vote.gov link sharing. You see these amazing spikes. And so it's not symmetrical. Again, in these cases, the increases have been coming overwhelmingly from women, from young voters, and from voters of color. And so like young women of color, you're seeing numbers, registration numbers, where they're literally tripling, in some cases more than tripling their registration rates during these time periods. And so for me, it's meaningful for two reasons. It's just more voters who are likely to vote for the vice president, to state the obvious, is helpful to the vice president's campaign, but also perhaps more impactful just in terms of raw numbers and the ability to impact the outcome of this election. That would suggest that these groups overall, not just new registrants, but those who have been registered for a while, but maybe they registered after the Dobbs decision in 2022, maybe even before that, and they were considered lower propensity voters who are less likely to vote. Well, this would suggest that those groups are going to have higher turnout come November. So that's why the analysis is interesting to me. And there's a reason to believe that that's not reflected in the polling because of the sort of cautious approach that I mentioned a minute ago.
can we talk about early vote? Because now people are voting. Can you talk about how many folks have voted already? And if we're seeing sort of similar trend lines or record breaking numbers in specific states related to early vote yet, or if it's just too early to tell?
It's early, but you're talking about many millions of votes. I don't know where we're at
It
today.
was just over 7 million, but we're recording on
Perfect.
Thursday.
Yeah, it's a lot of people voting. It's probably in the end only maybe 10% of the total early votes we are going to see have come out so far. But the early signs, a lot of people are talking about Georgia, rightfully so. They kicked off early voting this week. And first 2 days of early in person, they had record breaking turnout. So, like, the easiest conclusion we can draw from that is that there's a high level of engagement. I think we anticipated that, but it's a reminder that if you think back to a few months ago where we weren't headed towards a very high turnout scenario. Voters in general just weren't very excited about the idea of a rematch. I believe that would have changed, and at this point you would have seen higher intensity, but likely not anywhere near what we're seeing now. So check one box there. Is like voters are engaged. You're seeing high turnout in some of these states, especially from older voters. The early electorate is much older this time around than it was in 2020. That doesn't mean that young voters are not engaged and enthusiastic. What we expected to see happen is a lot of voters are going to pivot from voting early in 2020, when the pandemic was a big deal, to voting on election day this year. And that'll overwhelmingly be younger voters. We saw that in the NBC poll that was released not that long ago. So yeah, I mean, those are some big takeaways. In Michigan, one of the things that was interesting to me was seeing huge turnout among Black voters, especially older Black women, especially in Detroit. Certainly a good sign for the vice president's campaign. But you are seeing Republicans turn out early at a higher rate than they did 4 years ago. Again, we expected this. Donald Trump convinced, somewhat bizarrely, his supporters that voting by mail was fraudulent 4 years ago. And you saw lots of Republicans come out after the fact and say, what a mistake that was. That hurt us. Some claimed that cost them the election. And so they've put a lot of effort and energy into changing that. Frankly, the shifts we're seeing, though they're real, I almost expected to see bigger shifts
Yeah.
because of all the talk that they've engaged in over the last few years about how they're going to change it. I think maybe we're seeing the cost of them not having a real campaign. I'm not saying they don't have a campaign at all, but as we know, the sort of investment in the party infrastructure that's happened on the Democratic side, you think of the robust state party environment. Whereas on the Republican side, they've sort of bankrupted that infrastructure so they can pay off Donald Trump's lawyers. It's possible we're seeing the effect of that now. Again, it's early. In the next week or so, we'll get more data in, certainly to the point where we'll have a little more confidence. But that's what we're seeing, at least at this early phase.
I was just going to say, I just read this morning, I read a Substack by a Republican digital strategist called Doom Scroll. It's sort of like the Republican version of For What It's Worth that we write at Courier. And she was actually lamenting how she wasn't seeing pretty much any GOTV ads or engagement from Republican campaigns online in particular. And Democrats are outspending Republicans hugely just on get out the vote, mobilization messaging, and infrastructure. I think that it looks like from the numbers in terms of ad spends that the Trump campaign is sort of relying on the super PACs that Elon Musk is heavily funding to take care of their turnout, which is interesting because he doesn't have a lot of electoral or political or voter engagement experience. But I just wanted to echo that even a Republican strategist was suggesting that they just didn't have the turnout game or infrastructure that Democrats are approving.
Well, and Tom and I were talking earlier today about how Republicans spin everything, right? And there's no spinning right now that the early vote is going well for them. There's just nobody saying that on their side, which is a sign that they don't think it's actually going well for them. And just to put an exclamation point on something Tom said, it was sort of our belief, he and I did all this early vote analysis 2 years ago in the midterms. It was our belief that it was likely that we would see Republicans to be doing better than 2020 in this election because of them now trying harder, right, with in the early vote. And also because some of our younger Democrats are going to be voting as independents because we've seen a big increase of young people registering as independents. So some of our vote was actually going to live over in the independent column. So it would make it look like we've lost Democrats, right? So we expected, and Tom did a whole briefing for the campaign 2 weeks ago, letting them know that the likely data would be that we'd be underneath 2020. And some people could argue that there was intensity problems on the Democratic side. The truth is we're above 2020 right now nationally, and we're way above 2020 in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, which is not what we expected. And so right now, I think there's far more evidence, as both of you have been saying, that the Democratic coalition is bringing intensity, and our superior organization is moving people to go vote in a far more effective way than they are, which is why I think, Tara, going back to the whole premise of this show, right, is that there's evidence that we're closing stronger than they are in the early vote, and people should be encouraged, but we still have a lot of work to do.
As y'all know, like pushing, chasing, getting the early vote out, it is very labor intensive. And to your point, Tara, it's like, it's not something that if you haven't done it before, you can just kind of pick it up. And so Republicans have spent years telling their side that it's fraudulent, that ballot harvesting is some type of crime. And now to try to pivot at the last moment when they've spent so much time convincing their supporters otherwise, sort of two things happening. Like they're victims of their own propaganda campaign potentially, and they're also victims of just not having that sort of campaign operation. Whereas you see the early data in these states where we have invested, again, looking at North Carolina will be an interesting state to watch for a lot of reasons, but the early vote there obviously got started later because of court challenges and because of the storm. Early results we're seeing there are looking good as well, where Democrats are outperforming there as well. So another one I'm looking at. But yeah, again, let's check in next week on this. But it looks like Republicans are reaping what they've sown over the last few years at this point.
Yeah, to steal a line of Simon's, we're winning, but we haven't won yet. So we can't we can't rest on any laurels for sure. But I can't help myself on this point because I got into a lot of arguments with strategists on the Democratic side early on in the campaign before Harris became the nominee, where they were really counting on a low turnout election. And to me, that was always crazy. I think there was a little bit of hope for a lower turnout election amongst some Democratic strategists that won't be named because they were so worried about the lack of enthusiasm that I understood, and it was real to some degree. But I shared your belief, Tom, that it at this stage in the race, even if Biden had been at the top of the ticket, more folks would have been more engaged. But the other thing I want to remind folks of is that in 2020, Dobbs had not happened. Roe v. Wade had not been overturned. The January 6th insurrection hadn't happened, which I do believe peeled some Republicans and Trump supporters away from him because of the inciting of political violence and just utter disdain and disrespect for our government and our democracy. And so, we've all entered this not knowing what was going to happen. So I personally am not that actually surprised. Again, not resting on any laurels, but we're in a very different country today than we were in 2020 in many, many, many ways. And I think that women in particular have shown up every single election and opportunity they've had since the Dobbs decision by the Supreme Court to vote as a referendum against the MAGA agenda. And I think that we are going to see that again. And we already are in the early numbers, which is really exciting.
And it's why Democrats have outperformed polls consistently since Dobbs, right? It's the same cautious approach that I was referring to a minute ago in terms of the pollster assumptions. Let's look at what happened in 2020 as a baseline and then sort of adjust for population changes. Again, that's pretty cautious, but the data for the past 2 years overwhelmingly suggests otherwise, to your point, that we will see higher turnout from women, especially younger women. And so to see that materializing into voter registration data would support that. And, again, the whole story won't be written to state the obvious until election day. The one caution that I would offer that I think we would all share is that Democrats will go into election day needing a higher turnout from younger voters than we did in 2020 because of this shift away from the pandemic environment. So it just means more work to be done. But, obviously they have a campaign built around doing exactly that.
Thanks, Tom. It was great. Good to see you, brother. I'm just so grateful for your work. And Tara, I just want to acknowledge, as you and I have been in this thing for a long, I've been a little bit longer than you, but you've been in the weeds here in this business, that Target Early, this site that Tom's firm has made available to us publicly, they're doing this on their own dime. I mean, it's an incredible public utility. It helps Americans really get a better understanding of their own election. And so, Tom, just also as a proud patriot and fellow warrior in this thing, thank you guys for making this thing available. It's been really helpful.
Yeah, we love to do it.
And it looks like your campaign, Simon, to get everyone to vote on day one really turned up in Georgia. So thanks for that.
Well, can I tell you
Over
where it also turned?
300,000.
I know, I know, I know.
Yeah, you'll see it in Target early. It's actually across the battlegrounds. It's actually amazing when you look at you can look on the site at the super voters, the people who are sort of those people that vote fairly reliably but maybe weren't voting early, and to see that turnout right from the beginning. Simon and I have talked about that. Like, well, I guess it worked.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, brother.
Thanks, y'all.